This is Intervention TV, a business podcast. We focus on business and organization interventions, as well as learning and development interventions. If these topics are important to you, subscribe and like to join our community. Okay, Jay Clark, we are really excited to have you. Congratulations on everything that you've accomplished in your incredible life. Why don't you give our listeners a little bit of view about what that incredible life is like?
Well, thanks, Jake. I've worked in K-12 education in Ohio, public ed, for 29 years. I started as a teacher, a classroom teacher, and then an assistant principal, superintendent, and now I support 8 school districts in a region through curriculum and instruction, things like that. I work with their principals pretty directly at the secondary level, middle school and high school. I'm part of the DODC program at Bowling Green. This is my 3rd year, so I am starting to get deeper into dissertation work, which is exciting and fun, and something that I never thought I was going to do. Every step of the way in my career, I thought I'd be a teacher for 30, 35 years and then retire. And it's just taken all sorts of different twists and turns in my journey, which have all been fun and all been different, and live here in Northwest Ohio with my wife, and we have 4 children.
Well, that's awesome. One of the things that you have been studying is participatory change. Mm-hmm. And so I think let's talk a little bit about that today. I wonder if you can define participatory change in a way that would make business leaders really interested in learning more about it.
Yeah, sure. So I think the value in participatory change is that it helps kind of mitigate risk, and in the long term improves that execution of the change, right? So it's co-designing at some level those variables of a change formula. And right now, as part of that dissertation I was just talking about, I'm kind of knee deep in Jordan Wareham, who's a Bowling Green DODC graduate. He developed a successful change formula, and it centers around the intention of the change, which is vision and commitment, and then the execution, which is the action plan, and then supporting mechanisms for that change. And statistically, he did the quantitative work. Those variables have an overwhelming impact on change, a large majority of the variance. So it's not necessarily consensus seeking. It's not that we're going to get everybody to buy in or get on board necessarily. But the way I look at it is every organization is changing every day. We've got something that needs to change, or that we're wanting to change. And so the job of participation really is to make sure that the decision can survive the contact with the people who have to make it happen, right? Because at the end of the day, we can make a decision and make this happen as leadership, but then if the people that have to do the work, if it doesn't work, if it's not doable, not feasible, then we take steps back. So we waste time with that, trying to retool or figure out how we're going to redo this. And at the same time, we've lost some base value with those people who have to do the change, right? Because they're saying, sure, if they only would have asked, we could have told them this, and we would have saved money, time, all the resources, all those things. So that's why that's my definition of participatory change, is that I think it just really mitigates risk and improves change execution.
So it's like leadership, right? They have kind of this high level view. They're standing on top of the pyramid looking down, but getting the different perspectives as you move through the pyramid is very helpful as far as establishing what kind of movement our business is going to take going forward, because these people are able to say, hey, this is something you missed, or hey, this is not going to work because of things that you don't know about. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that can look all sorts of different ways. It may be something very structured, very formal, but it might just be a quick check-in with someone to be like, hey, and we've talked about this. If we change this, what does that look like? What would that do? How could that, be helpful, or how would that be a problematic potentially? So exactly right.
You were talking about maybe the formal versus the informal. just
Hmm.
now, and that can work really well either way. But I can imagine, leadership coming down the ladder and asking basically, confirm what I think already, or something like that.
Right.
So
Sure.
if we're looking at, genuine participation, what does that look like? What are we really thinking about?
Yeah. Well, I think it's kind of a spectrum. Like you kind of mentioned there, you kind of alluded to, is from, I mean, it can go everything from just consulting, just like you said, poking your head in someone's office and being like, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Like, how would this work? What are the pitfalls, or what are the things I'm not thinking about? All the way to co-creation, like co-creating, a change from bottom up. And so I think the things that it does, obviously, it builds that trust, it creates alignment, it builds that commitment with people who are in the organization. And when done well, people appreciate that their perspectives are considered. And so it kind of creates some of that fairness, that procedural justice, um, but also realizing that everyone might participate in different ways, right? Bringing different strengths, bringing different preferences to that. So I think a really important piece of the puzzle that I really didn't know much about formally until starting in the doctoral program is psychological safety, right? You have to have that to have that genuine participation. You have to have that culture where dissent is okay and people aren't punished for it. And without that safety, really, that participation is really just performative, right? It's just theater
Yeah.
because people aren't going to say, this isn't going to work. I know that you're dead set in making this change, but you got to listen. Like this is not gonna this isn't feasible. And I think one thing that people tend to kind of conflate participation with is buy-in. And I
Sure.
think it's kind of interesting because I had a kind of an argument with a colleague once about buy-in. He said it wasn't necessary. He was kind of a top-down guy. He said, people just need to do what they're told. We don't need buy-in. But I would go kind of the next step that participation doesn't require large-scale buy-in because your participants have co-created the change, right? So you don't need to buy into something you created. You already had the
A
buy-in,
built-in buy-in.
right? Right? You built it. So yeah.
No, that's really cool. When it comes to that psych safety element,
Hmm.
um, one of the questions that comes up is how do you build that? And I think a lot of managers might be interested in, hey, I really want psychological safety, for this instance. I really need it for
Hmm.
what we're doing right now. But then they're not really willing to do it all the time because that might interfere with my perception of my own authority. But it really does need to be something that you model constantly. People can see you being challenged frequently. People can see the leadership being vulnerable and being willing to listen all the time. And then when you need it, it's there.
Hmm.
Would you agree
Oh,
with that?
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're exactly right that it's not really, it can't be an event, right? It can't be an episodic type of thing. Psychological safety has to kind of be this undercurrent that, people are okay and feel that they can speak up or they can, speak against something. Obviously, it doesn't mean that everyone gets their own way all the time by
No.
any means. But I agree that psychological safety, and it's a tough thing to build, and depending on the background and the history in an organization or with a team or a group, I mean, it can be very, very difficult. And the simplest things can derail it, I think, really quickly. And so it's kind of like trust in a way as well. I think trust is certainly a part of psychological safety. But when I think about it, with leaders and people who are participants, or employees in an organization or whatever, I think the leader demonstrating vulnerability, um, just the way we approach things, um, the way that we build relationships with people. I think all those things. I haven't done a deep dive of psych safety by any means, but I think all those things from my own experiences, those things build that psychological safety.
You were talking about a manager that maybe has a more top down approach to those kinds of things. Um, Is there a time and a place for that? Like, where do you balance the participatory
Yeah,
approach to policy change, or whatever kind of change, as opposed
yeah,
to, the guy at the top is just going to say, "Here's what's up."
yeah. I think, well, I think as a leader, I mean, you have to figure out what that line in the sand is, right? Like, what are the instances where you've just got to like command and control? That's what makes sense. It might be, imminent safety or a legal crisis or something like that. And I think in those instances, sometimes, and I think about my own career, there's a lot in working in a public sector. We get mandates from the state and the federal government that say you have to do this, by October 1st, this, you have to implement whatever it is, right? And so at that point, I don't have control over the what, right? That decision's already been made. That's a non-negotiable. But we can maybe enlist participation around the how. Like, how are we going to do this? We know that the state says that we have to do this. So I'm going to bring the people that it might affect, or people that can help me determine how to best meet that mandate together, so that we can figure that out for what works best for the organization. Um,
Yeah,
I
I
think,
work with like federal and state regulators sometimes, and
yeah.
I do instructional designs. We'll build training for people, and it is like you're
Mhm.
saying. It's this was decided on high, and that's what's going to happen now.
Right.
But
Yeah.
kind of what you're saying is, even if that's an appropriate response, there's going to be somewhere in there, whether that's the how or the implementation, or building the training, because I'll work with the different people, and so what
Mhm.
actually is taught is going to not that's not coming down from top. That's
Right.
so
Exactly. Yeah.
something in there is going to be participatory, or could be participatory.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And at least you can kind of relate everything to your own organization, because it's going to be different for every, organization size. Like, I think about my professional role. We serve a school district with 125 students, K-12, all the way to a school district with about 1,500 students, K-12. Neither of those are large school districts
No.
when you look at the whole country, right? But we have to handle those two school districts and everything in between very differently, just because of their scale, right? And so how they're going to implement something that comes down to them from the state that's decided for them, is going to be very, very different. And I think about, I think too, when you look at things that happen quickly, where you can't pull everybody together. I had a situation as a school superintendent where we had lost a coach and community member. He was a police officer. He was killed in the line of duty. And this was someone in a small community, so everybody knew him, and he had graduated from the high school. So there was a lot going on all of a sudden. That happened late at night. And so early the next morning, we had to figure out lots of things. There were things I didn't know about. I mean, there are things, with first responders and the family of the victim and our staff and administrators, and kind of a high profile event that we had to work in, and our community members, and then the media was on top of all that, right? All that's coming at once. And so, with the context of all of it, that we have family members in the community and students and staff who are grieving this loss as well. So I couldn't do that all on my own, but there were things that I had to quickly determine, okay, where do I need input? Who do we bring to the table? And luckily, I mean, an unfortunate event, I feel like, things went rather well, because we were able to communicate, and I was able to utilize, kind of leverage that participation, so that we could make good decisions at the end of the day.
I guess getting that perspective of the more rural school district and how that might manifest. Are there any other insights that make the K-12 environment unique, as opposed to maybe an office environment, or other places that people would be familiar working with?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, definitely schools, and schools of all size, and no matter where they're located, they are oftentimes kind of the hub of the community. So, those changes that you make, or those decisions you make as a school, that they directly impact the students and families, and the taxpayers are ultimately paying the bill. And so there's kind of a layer of emotional weight to everything. There's a layer of accountability that may not be there in all sectors. Um, I've been fortunate to work in smaller systems my entire career, which is easier and harder. The easier side is that we can gather the right people in a room really quick. We're definitely more agile, but it's harder because those small communities have a very strong local identity, and they don't want to give that up, understandably.
Yeah.
And so, there can be a lot of historical context to things. There are what are described as multiplex relationships. So, you may have a third grade teacher who's also the mayor of one of the villages, who's also a Sunday school teacher, right? And so they have all these different roles, all these different hats they wear. And then, in small schools, you often have kind of that stretched bandwidth in roles, because at the end of the day, we still have all those same mandates that a school district with, a central office that's the size of, one of our schools, potentially a number of people. They're all doing their work. And, a small school may have, a principal or two, a superintendent, and someone that works with the finance, and that could be it. But yeah, I mean, I think public education is a complex system as it is, but I think that there are definitely advantages in being able to change course quickly in a smaller district, smaller system. But you just kind of have to have all those things, all those tools aligned, right, before you make that decision.
For sure. No, I've worked for companies where I had, a 20,000 person internal audience. And then I've
Sure.
worked with other companies and it's like there's 12 of us and we're seeking an audience and it's, not even half that big. Um but yeah, no, that smaller environment really makes a big
Hmm.
difference. But I think one of the things that you're kind of coming at is that the smaller environment allows for more accountability, right? The more local governance, I can
Hmm.
go to a city, a town hall or something like that, as opposed to something being enacted on the state or federal level where they're rather insulated.
Yeah, right. Well, and I think about, I worked in the same school where my children went to school for 17 years. And so, every event I would go to as dad, I was still Mr. Clark, who would, someone would seek out. And I always joke, my wife and I joke, I still always sit at the end of a row, because if they need somebody to figure out how to,
You can jump
work
up and
the
go
PA
help.
system, right? You know what I mean? Or we've got an issue in the bathroom, the water's, I jump up and go handle it. So yeah, and that's a different piece of the puzzle, where every decision you make, you'll see the people that it affects in the grocery store and in your neighborhood and everywhere else.
Yeah. Okay. So let's continue with this idea of the trade-offs.
Hmm.
Participatory change is criticized for being a little bit slow, right? It's not just a
Hmm.
person making a decision, it's quick. This is, I need to gather some information, I need to figure out what I got that was actually useful, I need to collate it, communicate it, put it in a way that makes sense. So would you say that, where would you say the trade-offs are? Like, does that make it worth it? Does that make it, is that slowness maybe a real problem that we see? Or
Yeah. Well, I think the question is, when, we're going to have slowness at some point, very likely. Not all the time, right? I mean, there could be a change that you everything just worked out well, and you didn't use participation. That happens. I'm not, but
military?
yeah, right. I mean, it can, but I think, I guess the question is, when do you want to go slow, right? You could start fast and skip those checkpoints and check those check-ins with people and getting other perspectives, and then roll something out, only to have to roll it back because you didn't have all the information, right? Or you can go, kind of the idea of going slow to go fast, where if you get everything in line and do your homework, in lack of a better term, then you can move things quickly once everyone's on that same page. Everyone has the understanding. You have all the details you need, all the information. Fast decisions basically often result in like compliance, and kind of passive withdrawal from those
Sure.
participants, because they're like, well, they didn't ask me, they didn't ask our opinion on this or our input, but it is what it is. Um, and I worked with a group that was making a really deep philosophical shift in their practices. And from the beginning of that journey, we kept talking about the fact that this is going to be 90% is going to be the philosophy and 10%. They wanted to jump to the implementation. How are we going to do it? Let's just talk about the philosophy. That's going to be the bigger piece. And I gave them the permission to take the time to have those difficult conversations and to really dig into it. And we stuck it out. 2 years later, we started a large scale change that was really successful. And that project specifically was one of those things that I learned so much about change. And I was, in public ed, we often really want to go fast because honestly, every decision we don't make and every time we don't act, we've got kids who are losing out on something potentially, right? And so you don't want to shortchange a class of students because we couldn't make a decision or we couldn't move quickly. But at the same time, we've seen it time and time again where we move quickly and the teachers don't buy in. They don't have the resources they need. We didn't think about the schedule, all those different things that end up as byproducts of our willingness not to engage in participation.
So it sounds like you're taking the concept of a slow change versus a fast change, and you're saying, no, you're shifting the slow. Is it up
Right.
front,
Yeah.
or is it
Mhm.
later on after you've already kind of tried stuff and now you're reconfiguring it?
Right. Yeah. And I think about the change I would describe, and that the journey was so useful to everyone. And it built that psychological safety. I mean, I saw that happen in real time with people because we were willing to have some difficult conversations with each other. And those were, we took time to do that. They were kind of framed, or, there was logistics so that we knew kind of what was coming up. It didn't surprise anybody. We didn't, because it was an emotional thing that had to happen. And it was amazing how it shifted relationships. And like I said, that change was there was a lot of longevity to that it was transformational, just because of what we were able to accomplish.
Well, I like how you say journey there,
Mhm.
because rather than framing this as a criticism about slowness, this is the process actually working and actually making change, in a way that makes sense, in a way that really influences the people that need to have the benefits there.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, I like that. If participation changes the decision, then leadership gives up some control, right? But
Hmm.
if participation doesn't change the decision, then was it really participatory? And I guess my question is, how do we understand that relationship between leadership and the participants when it comes to a kind of collaborative change?
Yeah. Well, I think first, like John Cotter says that control is an illusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the reality is that some people ultimately make the change a reality. And so those people bring all sorts of luggage with them. Some of that is constructive, right? And some of it is not constructive, that we have to understand as leaders. And so I would say, again, participatory change is not binary, it's a spectrum. And I think the art of leadership is determining to what degree that participation is necessary. And so I think it centers on listening. I think that the leader's role is really not having the answer necessarily, but being curious, making sure the right voices are in the room to optimize that execution. And I think one of the things, kind of going back to the larger change initiative I talked about a few moments ago, it's not only the participants to the leader, but it's also participant to participant, right? That communication
Okay.
and those conversations can be very, very insightful, very useful, really have a large payoff. And so kind of unleashes that collective wisdom, right? I think it's important for leaders not to engage in like pseudo participation, right? Where it's performative. The decision's already made. We already know what we're going to do. We already signed the contract. This is already happening, but we're going to bring you in and pat you on the back and make you feel good. Because at the end of the day, right, it's not measured by whether the decision was changed, but whether the reasoning for that decision is understood and the people that are affected had that real input into the execution.
No, I think that's really powerful. especially if you're looking at it from a business leadership perspective. How are you, approaching this, and how are you, hope what kind of results are you hoping to see? So
Mhm.
that's really great. So you mentioned another topic that you're very interested in, and the way you said it was the humanness of change.
Yeah.
And I thought that was an interesting phrase, because you're not saying like the human side of change or the humanity of change. So
Mm.
so how do you understand that idea, humanness of change? And what does that mean that maybe traditional change misses?
Yeah. Well, and I think, unfortunately, I think all change involves humanness. It's just to what degree do we want to acknowledge it and leverage it
Yeah, are we
potentially,
accepting
right?
that really?
Yeah. It's interesting when you start to study change, just understanding people um, is so important. And my own experiences with change have always been connected to people, right? How students are affected, or staff, or parents perceiving a change, or the community. I would make a decision, and then I would face the people that it impact, where, in the hallway, or at the grocery store, or at church, or wherever, right? And so I think, because change is messy and it's not linear, people don't resist change necessarily. They resist the loss of competence, or the loss of routine, or identity, or control. So that's where the humanness of change really comes in, because resistance gets a bad rap, but really it can be very productive and insightful. And I've seen that as a leader many times, where I had someone who wasn't happy with a decision, and they would come to me and they would bring something that really made sense. And I think that that's the humanness of it, is then being willing to take a step back and be like, well, as a leader, I can just stick with this. And sometimes you have to. I mean, you've already decided on something and signed contracts or whatever. But at the same time, also being willing to step back and say, maybe that wasn't the best decision, and maybe we can pull back on it and do something differently.
But yeah,
But I think,
resistance is useful if leadership is receptive or collaborative. Is that?
right, exactly, yes, yeah, and again, that comes, resistance. The one thing that's interesting about resistance is people. Now, when I speak of resistance, I mean active resistance, right? Not the passive, not someone who's just going to sit in their cubicle and count the days, right? But someone who comes to you and says, hey, listen, this is a crappy decision, or this is why this isn't going to work, or I don't think this change is good. um People resist when they care.
Yeah,
If they didn't care, they wouldn't
especially
resist.
active
Right.
resistance, like you're talking
They would
about.
just comply or passively resist. But when
Update
they
their
actively
resume.
resist, they care. They care about the organization. They care about something that's going to affect them directly. It could be, their resistance to, my job's going to change drastically and I've got 2 years left. I really don't want to have to learn a whole new whatever, right? And that's real, and that's the humanness of change. Um, and I think too, kind of thinking about the journey and that metaphor, a lot of traditional management, I feel like, really focuses on the future state, where human-centered change focuses on the transition, like how people
Oh,
are feeling and how they're performing, and how that's affecting them as they're moving to that, whatever that change is. And so,
so it's not just
yeah,
the bright, glorious future that we have dictated is going to be awesome, but really, we're getting there. What does
right,
that cost? What does that require of everybody? How does that affect the people in my organization?
yeah, yeah. And I think that journey can be very, rich, I guess, for lack of a better term, if there's already some like informal authority um, built by that leader. And I kind of, I think that's built around ordinary stuff. So, like when I was a principal, I would check in with teachers every Friday afternoon after, the students went home. I'd pop in every classroom, just have a quick conversation about how was the week, what are your weekend plans, all those things, right? Um, Having integrity, doing what I would say I would do as a leader, building trust with people. I think all those things help build that informal authority, those connections with people. Then that translates to a journey where people are willing to understand that things might be in flux for a while. There may be some uncertainty as we determine what this decision is going to be or this change is going to be. But they're willing to kind of take that risk with you if you're willing to put yourself out there as the leader.
Okay, so I like what you said, the informal authority, because I may be forced to respect Mr. Clark because he's got the
Right,
title or whatever
right,
it is.
sure.
But if you're coming into my classroom and saying, "Hey, what do you think of this?" If you're coming into my school and you're paying attention to things, that makes a big difference in the way you're perceived and the way people are going to be willing to engage with you. But I like how you said that builds trust.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And psychological safety, right?
Hmm.
That's a piece of the puzzle. And you have to have that if people are going to truly participate in during that transition state. And you've got to also be willing as the leader to make observations, to listen, and then to change potentially and to shift what you initially thought, the roadmap was going to be. Maybe we'll have to take a little bit of a detour to make sure that we we take care of the people, right? The humans that are involved here.
Yeah, I had Nick Jacobs on a couple weeks
Mhm.
ago,
Yeah.
and we talked a lot about identity and the way that plays out in organizations. And I think what
Mhm.
I'm seeing here with this discussion is that identity may be a major source of resistance, because if this change is affecting the way that I see myself and the way that I see my environment and that relationship, then that can cause a real problem. And so if I actually care about that, I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to have some sort of active resistance, or at least I'm going to be questioning what exactly this looks like on the other end, because
Yeah,
identity is a difficult thing to shift.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. That's very, very true. Yeah.
I think especially in your situation where a teacher, right, that is a very strong identity. That is a very powerful way of looking at yourself and looking at the way that you're having an impact on the world. And so when that shifts, when a new technology is coming in and we're going to start implementing it, whatever it is, that really changes the way a teacher sees themselves. I don't know if you've
Mhm.
seen that kind of thing play out before.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's the larger change initiative that I talked about. That really had to do a lot with teachers' identities and
Okay.
um, the autonomy that they had in their classrooms. And so we were changing um, basically kind of the way we graded things and how we looked at different assignments and things for students and kind of looking at mastery versus just completion, all those things. And that was a big deal because to teachers, that was kind of one of the last things in their classroom that they felt like they had true autonomy over, right? They could control that completely. And there were some things that we had to have some tough conversations about, the bigger ideas and the philosophies behind those that were all really good. That was definitely a piece of their identity as teachers, right? We can think about, the math teacher that did things a very specific way, and that's the way they wanted things done. And everyone knew that, and we were kind of pushing folks to think about changing that. And again, like I said, after 2 years, I think we ended up in a really good place, but it was a tough change.
Yeah, Joseph Yostrebsky has a whole body of work on that idea, and he's talking about it specifically to, working from home, working remotely
Hmm.
versus having to come into the office, and when that changes, what happens to people. And one of the things that he's found is that autonomy that you have working at home really makes a huge difference, more so than the society that you might have as you come into the office, things like that. So
Hmm.
yeah, I imagine that that's a huge thing to have to overcome when it comes to change in the classroom, because teachers have so many things coming down on them as it is, and those
Right.
few areas of autonomy that they have left probably make an enormous difference.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. You're absolutely right.
I have a fake company called Paradigm Incorporated,
Yeah.
and one of these days I'm going to find out that there's a real company called Paradigm Incorporated, and they're going to have things to say to me.
Well, it
But
could be interesting. Maybe they'll send you a shirt or something.
I've been advertising for you guys. Come on. So I'm going to read out this scenario, and it's sort of like a consulting scenario.
Okay.
and then get your response to it. Okay, so Paradigm is implementing a company wide ERP, and that's enterprise resource planning. A
Mhm.
system that does this will fundamentally change how employees perform their daily work. Leadership has already selected the software after a year long evaluation, but employees are incredibly frustrated because they feel their concerns are being dismissed and they're being asked to embrace the change, right? You've kind of mentioned that already. So, several departments have quietly begun creating workarounds before the system has even been implemented. You have been brought in as the organizational development consultant. Is this a communication problem, a participation problem? How would you address this, and how would you, diagnose it?
Yeah. Well, I would say that the leadership at Paradigm Incorporated have themselves a little bit of a participation problem because I think, from my perspective, the leadership there confused communication, telling people about the change, with participation, engaging them in the reality of their work and how, the decisions that they had to make. And so I think that the idea that the employees had to create these workarounds should be kind of a red flag and a signal to those leaders that, I mean, really, it's a valuable data point that they could have gotten maybe beforehand, right, to save face and to maintain relationships a little better. Um, but I think, that they're identifying those flaws in the software that they did, that the leadership missed. From my perspective, the solution would be to kind of pause and invite the employees in to help fix the system that they're forced to use. And obviously, a part of that is being able to admit, we screwed this up. This could have gone a lot smoother, but here's where we're at. We want your help now to fix this. And so I think leveraging their productive resistance, really, by opening a communication loop, would be important. I think trying to restore some psychological safety by acting on the loop. So it's not just a dog and pony show we're bringing in here, but actually acting on it and then using that in the future. Right? We don't want to keep repeating the same type of thing in down the road when we have different software or a new system or process to implement. So that's kind of how I would approach it.
In this situation, they've evaluated their software for a year. They feel really confident about what's going on, but what part of that evaluation involved getting everybody involved? You guys come look at this. You guys come tell us what you think about this, and maybe that part of the evaluation would have helped the change become much better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it could have been just, a small representative group, from
Mm-hmm.
the employees, the staff, or whoever was using it. I mean, that's the frustrating part is, taking just a little bit of time to do that really would have, I think, benefited the company in so many ways. But I've been there as the leader sometimes when you have to make a quick decision, or things are coming down and you have to forego that. And sometimes there are those missteps and create bigger problems for us.
Yeah. So have you ever had a situation like this where you invited, maybe three teachers from each school here and brought them all in to have some kind of conversation about that and maybe
Mhm.
facilitate a session?
Yeah, yeah, we did a lot, really. My Probably my biggest, when I was a superintendent, I mean, buildings and grounds stuff. I mean, I like to, do landscaping in my yard, and I can replace an outlet in my house, but I don't know how to maintain a boiler or a chiller for a huge school building. So um, that was definitely a piece of the puzzle where I knew I had to lean on the people around me for that, to help inform pretty big decisions. We had a multi-million dollar HVAC project that I knew very little about lots of parts of it, right? I didn't know anything about the HVAC part, and just the mechanics of that. But I also knew, I mean, really at the end of the day, I knew very little about finance, public financing for such a project and how that would look. And so I
Oh,
had to kind
yeah.
of, right? So I had to lean on all those people, and they're, trusted people, and they did right by me. I was lucky, but at the end of the day, it was, me having to make that recommendation to our school board to spend this kind of money and to take out this, this line of credit and all those things. And so that's, I always told teachers, I still believe wholeheartedly in when we hire people, that I don't want to be the only person in the room. I like to get the perspectives of other people when we do hiring, but I would also always kind of give the caveat that I value your input, but at the end of the day, this decision rests on my shoulders, right? I mean, but if this person ends up to be a disaster, then I have to, I'm the one that has to make decisions then at that point. So
Yeah, you take accountability, not
right,
the
I've got to be the
advisors.
guy that, I'm the guy that has to answer about it. So I guess those, that would be, those would be situations definitely where I, used people in lots of different ways. And I felt like had a pretty open relationship with staff. And I had a lot of people who would come to me, both good and bad, right? They'd say, "Hey, this has been great," or they say, "You know what, we missed the mark here. We got to change something." And and I think that the integrity as a leader is then to act on it, right, and not just pat them on the back and send them on their way and keep doing what you were doing, but at some point you've got to know that your people are struggling and whatever else. And so kind of that humanness side of it is to act on it and to try to make changes so that you can improve their environment or their situation.
Have you ever reached out and tried to get people together for a collaborative, for input and things like that,
Mhm.
and got really conflicting feedback?
Yeah, yeah,
What do
that
you
happens.
do when that happens?
Yeah, well, I think the one thing that I've learned is I always try to go into when I have those conversations with people, I always try to make kind of the objective or the goal, or if we have, if it's something that requires, like our values as an organization, kind of make sure that those are in the forefront so that we all kind of know what the goal is here. I mean, that doesn't always guarantee that everyone agrees on something, right? Or sees something in the same way. Um, but yeah, I have, and sometimes you just have to go to those people that maybe had the opinion that you're not going with, basically, or the input that you're not taking as much, and having a conversation with them that, hey, this is where we're at. This is why we made the decision we made. I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle. I know I heard this whole story about Costco. They had like their annual meeting with employees, kind of their administrative corporate employees, and they all came to some convention center or whatever auditorium, and there was someone with the CEO, and the CEO had to tell the employees that day that they were having to trim back their medical insurance, I think, health insurance. And he's talking to this author, reporter, whomever, and of course, like, well, aren't you worried? He's like, well, I mean, it's not great news, but we've built this relationship with people over time. So, and I'd rather just be upfront with them and tell them why, give them the why and tell them why, what's happening. And he said it was amazing because he went out, he told, gave this bad news to all these employees. And he said, and no one was like, seemed disgusted outwardly or anything. I mean, they just accepted it, and I mean, I don't think anyone was thrilled because I'm sure their premiums probably went up or their coverage suffered or whatever. But it's just, I think when you build those relationships with people, then they're willing to, they're willing to trust you that, sometimes crappy things happen, you know what I mean? And we don't have control over all those things.
One of the words that you've used several times is performative, and I think that if you're not approaching this kind of thing with genuine sincerity and authenticity, you can't develop the kind of relationship that you're talking about, the kind of trust that you're talking about, and even the kind of psychologically safe environment where people can be open and be real.
Mhm. Oh yeah, yeah, and it's funny because that word, I never really ever used it before, but my daughters always use it. I have twin daughters,
Oh,
and they always say that they're off to college this just in a few weeks.
oh
But
wow.
they use that word a lot about people. They're like, he's so performative, and I'm like, that's an interesting word. And it really it kind of hits on, some folks I've met throughout my life. I would say, yeah, they're kind of performative. It's just not genuine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're doing this just to check a box, maybe, or whatever, or climb a ladder, whatever it is. But it's not genuine. And I think, especially from my experience in small communities, small schools, people see right through that. A lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times they see right through that. So you do have to, and you have to have some buy-in as the leader too. You have to care about the organization. And I think that comes through very quickly for people too, if that's not the case.
Yeah, no, and I wonder if that really does make a difference, like in a more rural environment, because maybe in a more urban environment, you're inundated with performativeness. And so
Mm,
when you see it rural, you point it out immediately because it's weird.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
I
You're
don't know,
probably
but
right to an extent. Yeah, I would say that's very likely. Yeah.
well, it sounds like my kids are busy saying 6, 7, and your kids are teaching you excellent new words that you can use in your studies. So
And yeah, they still say 6, 7 too. So
always these things going on, these kids.
always. Yep.
I guess you kind of addressed this, but the overlap between the idea of participatory change and the humanness
Mm.
of change is maybe participation one of the primary ways that organizations express respect for the humanity of their employees.
I would agree. Yes. I think it definitely just that willingness to acknowledge,
Willingness.
their emotions and to have kind of possess that emotional intelligence as a leader. And I think really participation is how we operationalize the humanness, right?
Yeah,
That's how we make it happen.
that makes sense. But people will talk about like the deep emotions that come with a change initiative, that there may be a grieving period, that there may be
Mhm.
these different kinds of emotions that really come out, and they're very strong emotions, and they're very real. And being willing to respect those things, being willing to allow for these kinds of things to happen, really makes the organization um, feel respectful to its people.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Okay, well, 20 years from now,
Mhm.
if organizational change has done well and we've progressed the industry and the way that we think about it, what kinds of common practices do you think would be fundamentally different from how org change is done today?
I think at its core, I think in the next 20 years, if we think about that, I really hope that we can grow a clear understanding of organizational change for leadership. And I think that that's happened. I mean, I think you think about, watching Mad Men on TV, and that was all top down. That there wasn't a lot of participation, right? There wasn't a lot of you didn't see any organizational change happening in a positive way
Yeah, the
at that time.
authoritative
So
versus collaborative leadership.
right, exactly, yes, just all the things, right, and just taking into account um, the humanness, the emotions, and understanding what the process looks like you said, with the grief, and there's some loss sometimes, and all those things, right? So, and I think, at the end of the day, organizational change is really changing people, because organizations change because the people do. That's the way it really only works. Otherwise, it's minimal change. It's that compliance piece, right? People just do what they're told because they've checked out. They aren't bought into the organization at that point. They're not committed to the organization. Um, and I think, execution doesn't fail because people are resistant to progress, but when we forget those internal human stories driving those behaviors. And I think, on a few occasions, throughout my life, people who say, trust the system, um, I think they want you to trust the system because the people can't be trusted, right? So just trust the system. Don't look at the people. That's always been kind of a rub to me, at least,
Yeah.
because I feel like if you want that sustainable, lasting change, then I think we have to stop asking people just to embrace the change or trust the system, and start creating the space for them to help shape that change in that system. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think about, the time and the energy those employees shifted away from their customers or advancing their own work at the Paradigm Incorporated, right? Um, because they had to create these workarounds so they could do their jobs. And what if the leadership at Paradigm had proactively collected their feedback, even if it was just from key users or whatever, and used that to make that decision? Because at that point, the new software was just really a layer of frustration for their employees and not helpful to anyone. It may have been helpful. Maybe maybe it was easier for the administrative side or the leadership to access things, maybe the new dashboards or whatever. But at the end of the day, like I said, if we want sustainable, lasting change, then we have to have our people create that change.
Yeah, it's one thing to say, I'm changing the software. It's an infrastructure change, whatever. But
Mhm.
no, it's deeper than that. It's more complicated than that. It's more human than
Sure, right.
that.
Yeah. If it was just a behind the scenes server thing that, didn't affect anyone, that would be different. You know what I mean? But it's when it's something that touches people or their jobs or what they've known or their identity, all those things we've talked about, then I think then it's definitely worth the participation side of it.
Yeah, well, good. It sounds like we have a bright future to look forward to as long as we change in the way that Jay Clark mandates, right?
Well, it's yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you. This has been really informative. This has been really fun, and I have a couple avenues of research that I need to spend some time on after
Awesome. Well,
talking
thank you,
to you.
Jake. I
So
really
good.
appreciate sharing with you today and talking with you, and appreciate the opportunity.
All right. This is Intervention TV. Have a wonderful day, everyone.